People with dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID, are people who have different personalities or alters within them. And these alters or personalities may present themselves as having different voices, different mannerisms, and different memories. Some of the symptoms of having DID might be where people end up switching from one personality to another, and the personalities might have different voices, different ages, different genders, hold different memories, and behave in very different ways. Elle, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. I'm really intrigued and so interested to hear your story. So I always like to kind of start off at square one, early life experiences. What was things like for you growing up?
Well, things were quite tough because I was pretty much unwanted since the moment I was born. I was not really wanted by my mother, and she neglected me, she abandoned me. And I was pretty much raised by my grandmother for the most part, and
Yeah.
I fully moved in with her when I was about maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I have been living with her ever since. So I
Mhm.
had a childhood mostly of abuse and abandonment, and it
Yeah.
wasn't just my mother, it was other people that were close to me as well who were
Yeah.
doing the same thing.
So a really traumatic background.
Yes.
And what was your kind of early life experiences like in terms of mental health difficulties?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a very hard time with my anger. I was very uncontrollable as a kid. I was very angry, and I would throw things, I would damage things, I would threaten even my mother, and we went to a therapist to try to determine, what is going on here, and they had said like because of how I was doing some repetitive tasks and whatever, like I had like ADHD or something along those lines,
Mhm.
but it never went beyond that. But after that, when I started to become a teenager, a lot of paranoia started to set in. I was very paranoid of a lot of things. I had a lot of delusions that people were out to get me, and it was very scary because I would isolate myself. I could never trust anyone past
Yeah.
that point.
Just kind of going back to the anger thing, it sounds like such a normal reaction to a situation where a child is not being responded to emotionally.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I certainly see that now, but when seeing me in that situation back then, it was just an uncontrollable kid who cannot be,
Yeah.
controlled in any way.
So the delusions, do you remember some examples of when that started? Do you have any specific situations where you remember some of these delusions occurring?
I don't remember exactly when it actually started, or actually when it started to be pretty bad, because I remember when I was probably under the age of 10, I remember just kind of feeling as though people were watching me, people were looking at me, but it wasn't
Hmm.
ever a thing that really made me paranoid. It
Yeah.
made me scared. It wasn't until I was a teenager where I started to really shut myself off. I would pretty much back seat of the car so the driver would not be able to see me. I would not talk with anyone. I would hide myself whenever I was talking with my grandmother or anyone else in the family. I would sit on the steps so they couldn't see me. I would yell down to them pretty much. I would put like black construction paper on my window to block out anyone who may be looking in, and I was very private with anything, very suspicious of everyone, including my own family. So that was around the time that I want to say maybe 14, 15, 16 is when it was getting pretty bad.
Yeah, it must have been really tough to build connections with those around you. Were you very isolated from peers?
Yeah, I really didn't have too many friends. I did have a few that I did get along with well, but for the most part, I did not trust people, and I was bullied heavily in
Yeah.
middle school, high school, just throughout my entire school years. I was pretty much made fun of, so that made me even more isolated from people, and I did not want to be close to people because I did not trust them.
Yeah. How did you cope with that bullying?
Well, it was very difficult for me because I would blame myself. I would think that I was the person who was not worthy, that I should not have been born because these were the things that were told for me when I was younger. It was essentially just repeating my childhood trauma again, and I would blame myself thinking that there was something wrong with me. I never did any severe things. Like I never had really any like suicide attempts, and any sort of cutting that I did to myself was very minor.
Hmm.
It wasn't anything major, but for the most part, it was just a lot of depression. It was a lot of self-hatred. I would tell
Yeah.
myself that I hate myself. I can't stand being alive anymore. So it was mostly just vocal and me feeling really bad.
Yeah, gosh, such a hard start to life. Everything that you've told me so far, it must have been really, really difficult for you.
Yes, absolutely. And I never thought it would get any better.
Yeah, yeah, which I mean, to not have hope for the future is pretty dangerous for people, and that's where people will often contemplate suicide. What was the early signs of DID for you, where you started to experience some signs of alters?
Well, probably the first sign I remember kind of goes back to when I was a kid, and also around the same time that I started to feel a little suspicious as well. It tied a little bit in with some of the suspiciousness that I have. But the first earliest memory that I had was actually maybe around the age of 5 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this, I would call them a protector personality,
Yep.
and they were essentially a like guardian angel, so to speak. They
Mm-hmm.
were someone who could be there for me through the hardest times,
Yeah.
going through the abuse and the neglect when I couldn't get out of that situation when I was still living with my mother. It was almost like a guardian angel,
Yeah.
and the personality was very similar to that of my grandmother, a very kind and
Mm-hmm.
caring
Yeah.
person. So that's kind of how it began. And I would hear that inner dialogue saying everything's going to be okay, everything will be fine. And that was the earliest memory that I have of
Yeah.
that.
And quite a relief for you to have that protector, given the environment that you were in. You really needed protecting.
I did, yeah. And with that sort of situation, that was the only way that I could get out of the situation that I was forced to be in when I couldn't actually go to my grandmother's place.
Yeah. And was this experienced as a dialogue, an internal dialogue, or did this person come out in front sometimes?
I think when I was younger, it was mostly just internal dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
but I really do not remember too much. I mean,
Yeah.
still a lot of my past, I don't, I have memory of it, but I don't have any strong details, especially related to any negative things that
Sure.
happened to me. So I really don't know.
Yeah, of course. And then what happened as time went on when you started to experience more evidence of some alters?
Well, I did start to notice probably around the time that I was going through puberty.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a very tough time for me because, for me personally, I am a transgender woman. So I was
Yep.
born as a male.
Yeah.
And growing up, that was another source of my trauma as well. Just,
Yeah.
not being able to be who I truly was. But
Yeah.
growing up and being this male person that I did not identify with, I wanted to shut myself off entirely from the male aspect of myself. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we all have a male and female side, but I try to block it off. I did not want to associate it with it. I did not want to be part of it, and that would cause me a lot of issues. So
Yeah.
this also came from a lot of going through puberty, and being, I guess, all the sexual changes that are happening, all the
Mm.
physical changes that are happening. This is something that I heavily repressed. I did not
Yeah.
like it, but at the same time, I felt as though there was like a sexual side that I had that had to kind of come out in private and do, various sorts of things. And then
Yeah.
that was something that I just did not want to acknowledge. So I think that in itself was a different type of personality. And then from
Mm-hmm.
there, when when I was around like 22 or so, 23, when I fully transitioned,
Yeah.
a lot more came to the surface because now I was finally right with who I was.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to address some of those past issues. So that is when I noticed a different protector that was more of aggressive protector, she would be the one that would just take all of the negative responses to everything and just kind of like, I'm not going to be phased by this
Hmm.
type of thing. And then
Yeah.
there was also my deep-rooted core of myself, which was the person who was abused as a kid that was still trapped inside that did not want to emerge.
Yeah.
So those were that was the progress by which I noticed it.
Yeah. And then, how many altars have you had at the most? At a particular time in your life, how many altars has been the most that you've had?
Well, probably what I can remember, I would probably say maybe about 5 or so.
Hmm.
And I actually just remembered another one here, going back to one of your previous questions, the earliest time that I remember. And I remember as a kid, since I was very shy, especially around people I didn't know, occasionally I would become like I regressed like 5 years younger.
Yeah.
Like if I was 8, I regressed like 5 years, and I was playing with all these toys, and I was talking a different way, and people
Hmm.
would just kind of look at me like I'm kind of strange. So I think that was another part of my inner child that was neglected.
Yeah.
But
So you had this
so
younger altar who would come out, and uh, do you think the function of that altar was that that altar got to go back to being a child and got a bit of a release and a relief from expressing the childlike side of them?
I think so, yeah, being able to actually be that sort of child there, and it was like I didn't have a care in the world at all. It wasn't like
Yeah.
I was, afraid of anything. I was just this child. And what was interesting also, I'm fairly certain that this young child was also a female. So it's kind of that female
Hmm.
past self that I never
Yeah.
even had
Yeah.
anyway.
So actually,
So,
it sounds quite nice that the female child got to be female, and that was an experience that you never got to
yeah.
have. So it was kind of like getting to live something out that had been a really deep desire in you. I'm
Mhm.
wondering, when that altar would come out in front, would you feel quite relaxed afterwards? Was that kind of something quite therapeutic for you?
I would imagine so. Like I only really recall it really coming out when I was a kid anyway. Like I don't think it came out after past the age of 10.
Hmm.
Probably even past the age of 9, to be honest. But
Yeah.
um I really don't remember. I guess I probably would describe it like that. I mean, it wasn't like I felt like ashamed of what I just did, like not really, just doing that and making a fool of myself, because I would
Yeah.
have some memory. I wouldn't know everything that I did, but I would have some
Sure.
memory of it. But I guess it was kind of therapeutic
Hmm.
in a way, now that you mentioned that. So I never really thought of it like that, but yeah.
How have the altars shifted and changed over the course of the years for you?
I would imagine that they definitely have, because the protector that I had mentioned that I recognized when I was a kid,
Hmm. Did the
that
protector
one,
have a name?
well, I pretty much gave it a name when I was probably when I was dealing with a lot of this stuff, probably back in when I was like 23 or so.
Hmm.
And that's kind of how I identified them, because at the time they were just, I don't think they really had a name. It was just a way to identify the different ways that I felt. But
Sure. So would you give them names just to be able to kind of identify which altar was which?
pretty much, yeah. But it would also kind of come out as well. It wasn't like I would
Hmm.
sit there and just kind of think about it. It would just come to my mind. It's like, oh, this actually fits perfectly
Hmm.
with you,
Yeah.
because it kind of described their personality
Yeah.
in a way,
Yeah.
somehow.
So they kind of got a name that was very natural. The name kind of just emerged as
Yes.
easily as the altar emerged.
Yes.
So, what did you notice over the course of the years with different altars coming and going?
Well, I don't think that they really, for the most part, they didn't like come and go.
Hmm.
I just recognized them, and they were pretty much always there
Yeah.
up until the point of integration and actually appropriately dealing with them.
Hmm.
But a lot of them, when I really started to figure out where they came from and who they were, they had very much been close to about the same as they were when they first originated, because like trapped in some of the past traumatic issues that I had. So they were almost like, I guess a good way to describe it is like a memory capsule.
Yeah.
So it kind of like kept it in that frame of mind, kept it in that state, and it didn't really veer too far off of that until I was able to actually address it and kind of open up the memory capsule, relive those memories again, address them, and then just kind of move on from there. That's probably a good way to
Yeah.
describe it.
Did different alters hold different memories?
I would say so, yeah, because certainly the core personality that I had, the host is what I called it, which was like my real true self that was abused when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
That was the one that was blocking off any sort of healing from a therapist, because
Yeah.
when I would go to a therapist, it was the one tougher protector that would come out, and we would talk, and I would have this conversation with this therapist, and everything was like perfectly fine. And I was like, oh, I don't, nothing. I don't know why I'm here. Essentially, there's nothing really wrong with me. I don't have any sort of issues. My past. I knew that I did not have a good past, but I said I don't have a good past, but it's not really bothering me. But the truth of the matter is that it was all being hidden by this host personality that did not want to come forward with this information.
Sure. Would that personality emerge without your permission in the therapy sessions and then start hosting without you having much of a say in it?
Do you mean the protector? It would come out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the interesting thing, because my host personality had so much depression and anxiety. Pretty much the moment I left the house, it was
Yeah.
like it was already there.
Yeah.
So there was really no way for me to bring it out, because it was already going to be too anxious in that sort of situation. It wasn't until pretty much I left the session and maybe I was on my way home, or I got home, that I'm like, why has some of this information, why am I hiding this information? It just feels like, this is important, it needs to be addressed, but it's not.
Yeah. So was it a combination of you and the protector fronting in the therapy session, and was that sort of why the information didn't come out? Was the kind of the protector was taking some of the control in the therapy sessions?
For the most part, early on, it was pretty much all of the protector taking control of it, just
Yeah.
because that was my guard that I would put up, so I would not be hurt anymore because of all the past abandonment issues, all the past trust
Yeah.
issues that I had. So that protector was my wall to prevent any sort of thing coming in. And it wasn't until a few months in and even a year in that actually a lot of the deep rooted stuff started to come out. So it took a little while to get to some deeper rooted things here.
Yeah. When did you get diagnosed with DID, or when did you recognize that I must have DID?
Well, the initial diagnosis that I received from the therapist, and when I first went to a therapist, we had a few sessions, and then probably about like a month in or so, we did like almost like a half a day session of
Yeah.
just testing to see what sort of issues that I had. And the initial diagnosis that I had at the time was PTSD, schizoaffective disorder.
Yep.
It was a combination of bipolar and schizophrenia. And then it was like other sorts of anxiety disorder and depressive disorders and that sort of thing. There wasn't really anything with dissociation at the time.
Sure.
Now, I don't know if that progressed later on, because the therapist wasn't even aware of any of that until at least a year, maybe a year and a half in, when she would actually start to see the switch of the personalities.
Yep.
But I don't know, because I never really inquired about a diagnosis past that point.
Yeah.
But when I did first start having some suspicion about it is when, prior to me going to a therapist, so this is probably when I was like 21, 22, I started seeing a therapist when I was about 23. So my family would actually give like these different personalities almost like a name. They wouldn't give it like an actual like official name. It was more like, okay, this is the crazy girl, this is the angry girl, this is whatever else. And it was like why are you describing me in this way? It's like, it's because you're acting like a completely different person. It's
Hmm.
like I'm talking to a completely different person here. So that was the first inclination that started to make me start to wonder.
Was it quite apparent to people when the altars were switching in and out? Was that obvious to most people or just obvious to some people that you would be interacting with?
Well, the only people that I was really interacting with that I think would actually see it was like my grandmother and my sister, and they did notice because I was acting different. They're the ones that actually pointed it out. So, yes, they were the ones that pretty much let me know essentially.
Sure. And were you dissociating when some of the altars were coming out where you would lose time?
I would imagine so, but I guess I never really thought of it like that. I just wasn't myself. I was in a different frame of mind, and I think maybe a few times like it would happen in the car going to a long trip to somewhere. So I felt as though on the way there I would be fine, but usually like on the way back, um, it would seem like the ride was much quicker, I guess, due to some of these things that were happening.
Yeah, sure. And then, did you start? Was there a difference for you? Would some of the time you stay present and an altar was out, and you would know that an altar was out, but you didn't really have control of fronting what was happening, or that wasn't something that happened for
I
you?
never really knew about that up until I really started to learn more about the disorder and dissociative conditions in general because I really didn't know what I was experiencing. It was just being told to me by someone else. So
Sure.
I never really paid attention to that and I wasn't aware of that. I was oblivious to it. So it never got brought up to it never crossed my mind at the time.
Sure. And then you went through a therapy that involved integration. Could you tell me more about that?
Well, to me, it wasn't specifically about integration. It was in in my point of view, how I managed to integrate was because I realized all these personalities that I had were, as I mentioned earlier, kind of like a time capsule. It was different parts of my memory, different trauma and abuse in each one, and different issues that I needed to resolve. So, because I was very closed off to any sort of healing at the time, that is when I needed to make myself vulnerable, talk about a lot of the issues with a therapist, and open up these, yes, these capsules, so to speak, so I could actually heal. So it was through many years of actually talking about the past issues that I had and learning how to rationalize them because as I mentioned, I was very suspicious of people. I was very cautious of people. I would not allow people into my life. So, in order to heal that, I needed to be able to allow people into my life. And that took a long time to be able to do that, to be able to trust people. But that was just one aspect of the healing. So there were multiple levels similar to that to be able to address like each altar and whatever thing that they're holding. And then once it's addressed, once I'm able to cope with that properly, then it was like they became part of me. That's part of the integration process.
Did you have to go through every trauma and relive it in order to integrate the altars and help the altars and yourself deal with the past and what you've been through?
For the most part, yes. And initially, I didn't know what my past trauma was. I did not know. And
Yeah.
then things just started coming to me, and it was like the dam just burst. There was just
Yeah.
so much information. It was so overwhelming. And during that time, it actually made me feel pretty bad because I am essentially reliving it now, but it's not actually happening
Yeah.
anymore. A lot of those flashbacks are coming back. But I learned, I have to get through this in order to heal because that was the goal that I set for myself. I'm going through this so I can come out better at the end of this.
Yeah. How difficult was that for you to go through all of that trauma and relive it in order to try and heal?
It was probably the hardest thing that I have faced in my life that I am
Yeah.
fully aware of at least. Combine that with around the same time me transitioning as well, and I think that's kind of what opened the floodgates because I was able to be me when I transitioned. So once that was open, a lot of the healing could come in. I could not heal if I did not transition, is what I saw it
Hmm.
as. So it was a very difficult process for me, a very, very difficult thing. But yeah, it was just, it was just like
Yeah.
reliving it over again.
Some people, when they have to go through that process of reliving, will often experience great distress, mood difficulties in between the therapy sessions, a lot of dissociation from time to time. I'm just wondering, did you experience any difficulties in trying to go through the reliving process, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, everything you just described is pretty much what I experienced. I mean, it felt like things were actually getting worse
Yeah.
for me when I did start to open up because when I initially went into therapy, I had a few issues, but then once I started to talk about it, about a few months into a year into therapy, things actually felt like they were going down. I just felt as though things are not getting better. But I realized that, I have to learn how to take a hold of it. So I don't know how long it lasted that it kept going down, but it got to a point where I addressed it all and then I just started to heal. And
Yeah.
one memory that I do have that was related to the dissociation, it was I actually saw, well, actually, kind of, I don't know what term I'm looking for here, but it was a process when started making videos online and I was very scared of what people's reactions were. And I
Yeah.
would get a lot of negativity initially.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah.
a lot of people focus on that negativity a lot. And that's what I was doing. And I actually saw like an alter form based on what people were saying about
Mm.
me. And this is what was
Yeah.
very interesting because prior to that, I had no idea when these altars formed, or I don't remember them forming. They were just kind of there. So this one actually formed based on people calling me a fake,
Yeah.
a fraud, that I don't have any sort of issues whatsoever, that I'm just doing this all for attention and all this sort of stuff. This altar came from people's comments, and I actually saw it form, and it was probably one of the most scariest things because it would take control of me
Yeah.
and say all these things to me and verbally abuse me and even physically abuse me on a handful of occasions. And then it was like, all right, I'm just going to go away now. And just like the snap of a finger, it would go away. And that would leave me just feeling horrified. And that
Yeah.
was a really scary moment for me.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you've just described because trolling can be absolutely horrendous. And if
Hmm.
someone has an underlying difficulty with self esteem, those things that trolls say can really eat away at people in a way that can really crush them. And because you already had such a vulnerability because of the trauma you experienced, um, it must have really triggered something in you where actually the emotions that were activated were something that you weren't able to cope with at the time. And then this altar comes out, and the altar is trying to help you cope with this online abuse. But actually, in the process, the altar is not very pleasant to you.
Hmm. Yeah, it was a pretty rough because since I was at such a low point, it was hard for me to actually get a hold on it because it felt so much stronger than me at the time.
Did you attempt to try to communicate with the altar in various different ways to try to kind of negotiate more peace than how they were acting?
Well, that was the thing. I was living out of fear. There was no sort of conversation I could have. This was like someone who was very aggressive, very angry, very violent, and I just there was no sort of being rational with this personality. It was strictly there to do me harm, and
Yeah.
I felt as though I was like kind of like screaming, like, "No, don't do this to me,"
Yeah.
But there was no control over it.
Did this altar have a name?
No, it was just I would just call it what did I call? Yeah, I think I just called it like the controller because
Controller.
it said it controlled every aspect of my life.
Yeah.
So even my therapist saw that as well, and that's when she started to raise a big concern because of
Mhm.
how it was what it was saying to her
Yeah. So the controller would come out in the therapy sessions.
a few times. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then was the controller taking substances, self harming, any problematic behaviors?
No, because it didn't want to hurt itself, it wanted to hurt me. So the only thing that I remember that was a really, really bad thing that it did, and mind you, it would never actually be there by itself. It would be there pretty much co-conscious with my host personality
Mm-hmm.
to do it harm. That was the sole reason it existed there. So
Mm-hmm.
what I remember very vividly, and this was something that was very scary for me, it would come out and it would say, it would call me all these names, you're fake and a fraud or anything, and it would say, you're not worthy of being alive, and it pretty much grabbed a knife and put it to my wrist. It's like you don't deserve to live, and it's like, all right, I want to go away now, and you're going to have to look at this and deal with whatever consequences of it. And, it didn't actually cut me or anything, but just me hold it there, and then it would count to three. It left, and then I was fully back to myself and I just like threw it down. I just cried so bad. And actually a cat that we had came over running to me and comforted me a little bit, which
Yeah.
was nice. But that was definitely one of the scariest things that I encountered with this personality.
It sounds terrifying. So what you're telling me is that you had to be co-conscious with them, so they would only come out when you were also conscious, and then they were torturing you essentially by saying
Yes.
these nasty things, doing these nasty actions, and you had to bear witness to this without having control over what the
Yeah,
altar was
it was
doing.
pretty much in control of my body. Yeah.
Yeah. When did the controller leave you at peace, and how did you manage to get
How
that
did I
altered?
manage? Yeah, yeah. It was, I think, after being able to bring up my self-esteem because I realized that it came from those YouTube comments.
Yeah.
That's how it started. It started with like a little voice in my head, is what I noticed. And then it just progressively got worse. So once I was able to actually learn to love the person I was
Mm-hmm.
and learn to overcome some of that self-esteem issues that I had, then I was able to actually, once it started to come out, I'm like, I am more powerful than you. You are not, you cannot be here anymore. You are gone. So it was a power to kind of overpower essentially.
Yeah.
So instead of cowering in fear and being afraid of it, I had to stand up and actually rise above it.
Yeah.
And that's how all bullies are, in my point of view. They try to bring you down to their level, but if you stand above them, you can overcome them.
Yeah. How long did it take for that altar to fade away?
I don't know because I think it went dormant for
Mm-hmm.
a little while and then it kind of reemerged a little bit. But I want to say from the moment I started to hear it, it maybe took a few weeks or maybe like a month or two for it
Mm-hmm.
to get much more aggressive.
Yeah.
And then it probably took a few months after that for it to kind of slowly go back down, but I felt as though it was still there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of dormant there for probably about a year because
Yeah.
there was some sort of other issue that I had that I was not facing. It was kind of like there. And then it started to reemerge, but it was very different. It wasn't really angry anymore. It was more like, I'm going to control everything that you do. You don't have a say in what I do. Every action that you make is controlled by me. You don't have any sort of free will whatsoever. Is it
Yeah.
pretty much the type of thing it would say, and that kind of scared me a bit. But then I started to realize how I beat this before was by standing up to it and not being afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that second time it came around, it wasn't around as long and it wasn't as bad as it was before, but that was essentially what happened. So probably from start to finish, maybe about a year or a little
Yep.
bit longer, but probably about half of that it was dormant.
Yeah. Did you have certainty that the altar was gone when the altar finally left the system?
Yes, for the second time, I was fully aware that it was gone. Yeah.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
first time it left, I was not. I was aware that it was still there to some degree, as I mentioned, but
Yeah. What other experiences have you had with altars? I mean, that sounds like it was a particularly scary experience. Was there other things that happened after that?
after that, that was probably the final one to actually
Hmm.
truly be healed because that was actually probably the final step in the integration process.
Yeah.
So past that point, anything that has come up since then has been relatively minor.
Hmm.
Like, at this point in my life, I am much more capable of dealing with some of the depression and anxiety that I have, but it does
Hmm.
still come up to some degree occasionally.
Yeah.
It kind of comes up a little bit here and I deal with it pretty quickly. So that's kind of how it is with any sort of dissociation as well. So since that moment, it's really not been any sort of issue for the most part.
So, did you find that when you started to be able to deal with certain emotions better yourself, that the altar is no longer needed to try to step in?
Yes. Yep. Once I was able to strengthen my core personality, the host personality, then I could deal with the situations myself and they don't need to be part of me because essentially with integration, they become part of you. So you learn their coping mechanisms and how they deal with things and now they're part of me and I know how to do that now.
Yeah. When you were going through the therapy, was the word integration used a lot, or did that just end up being the result of the therapy? So, I guess the question is, was it the aim of the therapy, or was it just what ended up happening?
I think it's just what ended up happening because, as I mentioned initially, the initial things that we were working on were a lot of the paranoid beliefs and
Hmm.
delusions that I had. So that was the main thing, and then it went into all the PTSD aspects. Talking about all my past trauma and everything. And then my therapist would see some of these other personalities that would come out. I think it was only like two that came out to her, and then I don't really remember if we talked about integration at all. And if we did, it was probably during the very end because I was at a point where I was like, I have gone through so much at this point, and I think I'm ready to actually, you know, venture out on my own now. I don't feel as though I really need a therapist anymore. So that was a few years ago. But
Did you sense any resistance from any of the altars when you did start to embark on the journey of therapy? Was there any altars that were particularly resistant to that?
hmm, you raised a good question. I never really thought about this one either, and I would say I would say probably not. No, the only one that was really against anything was that controlling personality because it was against me entirely. It did not want me to get better, so of course it would be against any sort of healing. But I think the rest, for the most part, were on board with it because it knew that it would heal me.
So you had you've mentioned like a childlike altar that was there at one point, a protector altar, a controlling altar. Is there any else that you haven't mentioned yet?
Well, there were two protectors. The
Two
uh, the
protectors.
one was that guardian angel one that I mentioned, and then the other one was the tougher one. So they were
Yeah.
two different ones.
Hmm.
Um, the child one, and I feel as though there was a little bit of a male protector as well because, well, actually, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't a protector, just a male personality, and I
Yep.
think this was like my repressed male side of myself that I did not want to associate with.
Yeah. So
That's
that
probably
altar got to take on the male side that you didn't want. So
yes.
he was more comfortable kind of embracing that and taking on the male personality. So that was where there was almost like the outlet for your male side.
Yeah, but I never allowed it though. It was like any sort of thing I would just kind of shut out, and just like throw in the closet, so to speak. So it would just kind of build up in there, but it never actually really showed itself because I just didn't want it to. I was very
Yeah.
ashamed of it.
Sure.
Um,
So did that
eh,
mean that that altar didn't really get to come out and host and front? He sort of
yes,
kind of
for the
had to
most part.
stay in the background. Um, was he a voice that you could hear? Could you hear his voice from time to time?
Occasionally, yes. Mostly more when I was still a male because my female side hadn't fully emerged yet. But once my female side emerged, I think it kind of went dormant for a bit until I could actually pretty much just accept that we all have like a male and female side. And that took a bit because for me, I did not want to associate with my male side. And then once I was able to, I was like, okay, I get it now. I need to love all of myself, not just female and reject the male. So the other altar that I ended up realizing was, and it was related to the male altar. I didn't want to, associate with it. It was as like a sexual altar, and this was one that I just did not want to associate with my sexual side, especially when I was a male. So I would do the same thing as I did with the male person. I would just kind of throw it away. I did not want to associate with it. But of course, we as human beings, we all have sexual desires and everything. So it would pretty much come out in private by myself. And then I would always, feel so much regret with myself. I would always hate myself in regards to this altar. But for the most part, it was strictly like a private thing. It wasn't with anyone else.
So with that altar, in times of say masturbating when you were a male, would that trigger that altar to come out so that you got to dissociate and step away from anything to do with male sexuality?
For the most part, yes, and it was something, as I mentioned, like afterwards, there would be so much regret and hatred towards myself, and
Yeah.
I mean, I think I can only maybe count on one hand the number of times that I did not regret anything afterwards. It was just so much regret after those situations.
Yeah. And then when you went through the sex reassignment surgery, is that when that altar didn't really need to have a place anymore and faded away?
Yes, it did. I mean, it did take a little bit because at the time I was still, going through a healing process and I wasn't really comfortable with my own sexuality yet. But once I was able to come to terms with my own sexuality and realize that I don't need to be ashamed of anything, then it kind of went away. And I'm also thinking, and I don't know for certain either. I mean, I've been through physical abuse, emotional abuse. I don't know if I've been through any sort of sexual abuse, but if I have, then that would be another reason it came to be. But
Yeah.
I honestly do not know. I do not remember. It would not surprise me if I did as well,
Yeah.
but I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah. For people who have DID and they are thinking about therapy and they might be thinking that, oh, I don't want to integrate, or I don't want to go through all the trauma, or I really want to integrate, and there might be all these kind of topics that come up for them. What advice would you give someone who has DID, who's thinking of starting therapy, but they're quite apprehensive and scared of what the process might involve?
Well, I would say the number one thing to do is to be dedicated at what you want to do. So you have to have a goal in mind, set your goal for yourself, and realize that the journey ahead, it may be very difficult. It may be very time consuming. It may take you quite a long time with a lot of ups and downs along the way. But you have to retain what your end goal is. If you have that end goal in mind that you want to heal, that you want to integrate, then stick with that and don't lose sight of it, no matter what other obstacles come your way.
Great advice. And for some people, they might not want to integrate at all. They just might want to address difficulties. Maybe one of the
Mhm.
alters using substances, or conflict between some of the alters within the system.
Yeah, if that's the goal that someone has, that's still a goal, and you have to be dedicated to that and not lose sight of it. Just keep focused on it.
What was the duration of time from starting therapy until the point where you felt you'd integrated? How long did that take?
Let's see. I have it written down somewhere. I don't remember the exact date, but I know that I started therapy in 2013, the pretty much the very beginning of 2013. And I would have to say maybe 2017 or maybe
Hmm.
the end of 2016 is when I stopped going. So probably close to about 4 years,
Yeah.
maybe about, I'm thinking 3.5 years, what I'm thinking.
Hmm.
Because I think it was about closer to the end of 2016 that I stopped going. So
Yeah.
about 3.5 years. And the whole first year of that was really nothing much. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just kind of minor talk therapy because we really couldn't address some of the deep rooted issues.
Yeah. So that's it's really nice to just kind of give people that time frame. This is definitely not a quick process, but actually it's not forever. You know, this is
Yeah.
something that actually it took a number of years and very hard work on your part, and at times feeling like you weren't getting better at all. In fact, things were feeling worse, but there was
Mhm.
light at the end of the tunnel for you, particularly when you were able to really talk about the trauma and really address what you had been through in terms of those traumatic experiences.
Yep, that's very true. Yep.
Was there any trauma that was just too big for you and you just didn't want to go there because it was far too painful?
Absolutely, yeah. There were probably, well, there were two things that were very difficult for me to address, and one of those things, I, well, first I remember saying I'm never going to share these with my therapist at all. Period.
Yeah.
I'm just never going to do that. And then
Probably so much shame related to those
probably,
traumas.
yeah, and probably during the last year is when I just I knew it had to be addressed. Someone else had to really know about it. I broke down. It was just so hard for me to. So I told her one of the things. I didn't tell her the other thing. But then
Yeah.
it was actually really interesting also because probably maybe about a year ago or so, maybe probably about a year and a half ago, maybe. But I was talking with a friend, and we were getting into some deep rooted stuff, and then actually told him both of the things, including the one that I never talked to my therapist about. And I was like, it was still very hard for me to do that because this was something that I just did not want to share with anyone. It was just a
Yeah.
secret kept inside of me, but I did because I felt as though I could trust him and he would not judge me. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. We were
Yeah.
still we are still very close now. So you have to have those trusted people in your life in order to be able
Yeah.
to come out to.
And well done. It's a really brave move on your part that you dug deep and took that risk and were able to be so vulnerable with someone who was very trusted and supportive.
Hmm.
How did you
Yeah.
feel about the relationship with your therapist? Because that must have been scary at times to get so close to a stranger and not know, can you really trust this expert, this professional, or actually are they going to betray you? Are they going to let you down? Are they going to let you down in ways like other people have in your past?
Yeah, that is a good concern. And fortunately, I did pretty much have the right therapist since the beginning.
Yeah.
But initially, yes, I was very suspicious of her. I felt as though she was lying to me, deceiving me, that she was going behind my back and telling me these things just to do me harm in the end.
Yeah.
And this was a thought for that first year as I had my guard up, as I mentioned. And then from there, I guess I got a good read of her. I could really, tell that she was more involved with trying to help me and not so
Yeah.
much trying to do me harm. So that is when I was able to actually open up a bit more. So the relationship initially was, I did not like her. I did not want to be associated with her, but then it turned into something better.
Yeah, and that's a really amazing point that you made, that like you didn't trust this therapist at all. It was very difficult for you to build that relationship and to be so vulnerable with someone who was going to help you, particularly because of the trauma you've been through. But you stuck it out,
Hmm.
and things changed, and you ended up building up that trust. Did that help with other relationships in your life? The fact that you were able to build such a connection with a therapist.
I would say so, yeah, because pretty much during that first year, just in my life in general, is when I was having a lot of those issues with trusting people. I always thought people were doing me harm. And I feel as though that drove some people away that I was meeting at the time because they would say, "Oh, she's acting kind of strange here. I don't know why she thinks I'm trying to hurt her, but okay." So probably, you know, a little bit after I did start to trust the therapist a bit more is when I did start to allow more people into my life. I was still a bit on guard, but not as much. And then over time, probably in maybe 2015, 2016, closer to the end of therapy is when I was so much more open that it was much easier to communicate with people. And I think that was like the first time that I really didn't have that fear for the most part. So,
Yeah, it's amazing how therapy can actually kind of mirror what's happening in your life or you can get a little sample of a new relationship, and experience something very different interpersonally, and then you kind of take some risks and get to sort of have a repetition of that outside of therapy. Could you describe for me the person that you are today compared to the person who started the process of trying to overcome DID?
Yes. So the person I was in the past was someone who did not have much self-confidence, who was still trying to be very dedicated and was very goal-oriented, but could not really see past the self-hatred and self-esteem issues that I had, but could not trust people. But now, the type of person that I am, I do not really get too upset and angry at people. My emotions are so much more easily controlled at this point. I am a very successful person. I am someone who has a goal in mind, and no matter what, I will achieve that. I am probably one of the most dedicated people, pretty much than anyone I know personally, but very, very dedicated. And I say, no matter what challenge it is, no matter what thing I want to accomplish, I will achieve it. And the only person that will hold me back is myself. So I have to realize that and say, I can do this. I will do it, and I am doing it. And I'm not going to hold myself back because I can achieve it.
That's really lovely, and it really shows that no matter what people have been through in life, that if they're determined, they can really overcome their past and create a very different life for themselves. Tell me about the amazing work that you're doing on YouTube.
Yes, it all started on YouTube in 2013. It was actually, it was after my surgery and around the 6 month mark of me seeing a therapist.
Mhm.
And it was actually my therapist who started to watch my videos because that was like the only way that I could convey some information to her. Like, I made a video about my past and everything and
Yeah.
all the trauma that I went through. I'm like, I can't tell you directly, but please watch this video because it would help, and then we can talk about it.
How
But
powerful.
yeah,
And how
so
brave, because
I
you were publishing these and putting them out for the whole world to see.
well, that was the interesting thing of how I went about that, because at the time I realized that, I was still quite paranoid at the time. I'm like, people can read my thoughts, people can sense what I'm doing. So guess what? I'm not going to give that to them. I'm just going to put it out there publicly anyway.
Mm.
So then it won't be a secret anymore. So I publicly did that. And when you're making a video online, you don't see the people. You don't see the thousands and thousands of people who are watching you. You just see a number. All you're doing is talking to a camera. So it was so much easier than standing up in front of a crowd. So that is what I did. That's what I started with, 2013. And it's developed and grown from there. I talk about a variety of different things. I've talked about my own life. I've talked about how other people can improve their own life. I have a website now that I have all my articles and videos on. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun for me because just starting with YouTube back then, 7 years. Seven
Yeah.
years I've been doing it. So it's such a huge accomplishment in my eyes.
It's such an amazing story because it was so organic how it started. It started out of you just actually wanting to be able to kind of articulate yourself and tell your story.
Absolutely. I mean, I know from like before I started making the videos, another reason why I did it is because I realized that I have a lot of stuff that I want to say that I know can help people. And if it's just me describing my experiences, or if that helps someone, then that's great. And over the years, I've heard from so many people. So many people say, I love your videos. They have helped me through some of the hardest times. I always watch them. They've helped me be a better person. I have dedicated people from back when I first started, and it is quite remarkable to see. It really is. So they
Amazing.
have grown a lot. I've grown a lot, and we've all just grown together.